Ladies and gentlemen, I'm coming to you from Bryan Head, Utah. It is Wednesday. We are DebateSensei. We got Tim Seavey sporting the San Diego State University gear.
Coming to you from Punksville, Alabama.
So Matt Shapiro and I were on a hike, and I'm sure he'll be back sometime soon, but we kind of parted ways somewhere, and I don't
He's
know.
always called himself a woodsman. I don't know what that means, but that seems like he figured out like the moss on some side of the tree or another.
He'll be fine. He'll be fine. Yeah. All right. I mean, I was kind of hesitant when I drove away from our, the trailhead. But the guy's resourceful.
He knows bird calls. I'm sure he'll be fine.
Hey, today we are talking about how to respond to common novice mistakes. All right. Now, and one of our earliest episodes we had was about common novice mistakes. So it was about like how not to do them. But in all honesty, like nothing in debate, in my opinion, is really a mistake until your opponent capitalizes on it. You know what I mean? It's like you could say something and okay. So for instance, let's start with like the first thing, like not using all of your time, right?
Sure.
That's not that could be a bad thing. But if your opponent also doesn't use all of their time, then you know what I mean? It's like now the judge is sitting there kind of going, well,
very efficient round.
Yeah, I mean, both of them, you've made the same error on both sides. All right. So so that's kind of like the thing I wanted to go for today. All right.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes I would contend even more tricky to debate something when you don't expect like a very novice mistake on the other side. So I've heard it in debate, it's called stooping, right? Where it's like a team that's really good loses to a team that's like brand new and made all kinds of mistakes because they just couldn't grapple with, like, they just kept saying the same things, like they didn't have a specific plan text, or they didn't have a clear funding. And the other team's like, what's a funding?
Yeah.
And the other, like the more senior team just like melts because their brain's like, how do you not have blah, blah, blah? And they instead of actually articulating why something is bad and breaking it down, they just run for the hills with like the other side broke the rules, and then they don't follow through on those. And sometimes like that can really just completely devolve around, especially if the novice side has some like just general argumentative chops. Like if they are making sound claims, but they're missing fundamental pieces of debate. Like, those things happen, but I think it's tricky sometimes for a team to adapt and like, all right, how do I bring the other team into the fold to have the kind of debate that I want to have or that I was expecting to have?
Oh, Shap, you made it.
All right.
Out of the woods?
What do you do when the person is 15 minutes late to the round? What do you do then?
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
You immediately point out to the judge that they were probably doing something criminal outside of the round, and they should be voted down for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good to see you guys.
Like the first thing, when I have novices and they have an opponent, especially the affirmative comes up and they have a 5-minute time limit, but they only use 3 minutes, and then and now the neg is kind of, they go short for 2 minutes also because like, well, they didn't give me enough to say. I'm like, no, you can't. Yeah, you can't be doing that. All right, because this is a great opportunity for you to make the debate about your issues. Right? Yeah. It's a great opportunity just to take over. It's kind of like, well, they've basically forfeited their chance to make a bunch of arguments, so I'm going to make a bunch of arguments.
Yeah.
So I always suggest is like you gotta use prep time well. Like the debate starts like when you get your topic, whether or not it's a season-long topic or whether or not you get it 20 minutes beforehand. That's when the debate starts. And so even if the affirmative said nothing, if they came up and said, we think that the resolution speaks for itself and we will, open for cross-examination, you should be able to get up and use your entire time to explain why the resolution in and of itself is wrong. You know what I mean? It's like it should be voted down. Just the resolution by itself. You have enough reasons on your own to argue your full time and explain that. Any sort of arguments that you can refute is just like icing on the cake. You know what I mean? It's like, it makes you look good.
There's also like that aspect where I've done it. I'm sure you've both done it. You can kind of like front load what they could have said, and then take that down in order. And I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but you know, sometimes they'll say something. The other team, I guess it's kind of, you know, it could be either side, I guess, but the other team has potential arguments that they could make, and then they don't. And so you go up there anticipating them, and you go, well, look, I was anticipating them to say this, and they didn't, so you should not vote for it. But in my response to the only thing I could, you know, think of, which was a good argument, which they didn't say, is my response. And it sounds kind of, I guess, like you're talking to yourself, but often the arguments we're putting into the round are kind of obvious, or something that they missed, or aren't weren't fleshed out, explained, linked, whatever you want to call it, enough to where now you get to do that for them and then articulate how they didn't do it and then give your response. And now you're filling more time even with kind of telling the judge what they could have said. Or I'd be careful with that, but if they leave that much time on the clock, then yeah, I would definitely use those types of arguments.
Yeah. I think a common scenario is when the other team, you know, particularly if you're on the negative and the affirmative stands up and they do not follow the structure that you were expecting.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a very common one that you see. And it can quickly devolve into just a bickering over expectations and rules. And as a judge, I can say, watch it, like in the round, I've certainly had it happen before where like your brain starts to melt a little bit, like, oh my God, I thought we were going to be talking about something totally different. And now I have to, you know, take 5 steps back, and it's like this stumble. And as a judge, I can say that's not particularly persuasive when one side is just saying like, well, I expected them to say this and this and this, and they should be saying this and this. Like maybe you know that, but maybe not. If nothing else, the other side still gave arguments, even if they aren't in the format that you were expecting. The other side gave arguments. So you've got kind of 2 options. You can play that sport, like you can just engage with it in the way that it came, or you can be very clear in articulating why the arguments should be formatted differently and how they should have been formatted differently. And then, I think if you want to make like a procedural argument or something as to why one side shouldn't win, right? So it's like topics where it's like, you know, the U.S. federal government should increase restrictions on gun ownership, right? And they run a plan of like, we'll increase restrictions, and it's good because blah, 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 and they run through a million different things. You see that as a common example where a team will use a vague resolution as their plan text. And unless you clearly articulate out why significantly increase, you know, has to mean something, there has to be an actual specific plan text. If you don't articulate why that's a problem, then it just seems like you're kind of bickering over rules without referencing the rules. It's like, well, now you're just kind of whining.
Yeah.
That's not persuasive as a judge.
Yeah, you got to remember what is a rule and what isn't a rule.
There are very few rules. I mean,
coaches talk to their competitors.
More of a guideline than a rule.
Yeah. They say, all right, you got to do this, this, and this, and the debaters are like, oh, okay, well, that's a rule that I have to follow. They have like, you got to realize it's like there's like really the only rules are the speaking order and time limits. You know what I mean? And like besides that, it's like everything's up in the air.
Using that term, I mean, this might kind of in itself just be a thing that is in line with the topic of today, where, you know, a person, let's just call it a novice, goes up and goes, well, they're breaking the rule. What do you say in response to that? And I mean, I guess the rules are, you know, there's time limits. What are the rules?
I mean, specifically like plan texts, right? Like one of the most recent debates. Hold
on, let me just finish my point really quick. My point was just that Jared's going to tell you, you say that's not a rule. First of all, that's your response to someone who has no idea what they're talking about, telling you you're breaking rules is, A, that's not a rule, and explain yourself how you're not. You're just doing what you were, taught
and
to
B,
do.
It should not be a rule. It's like, And
run a critique on rules.
Yeah. But like one of the more recent debates I saw was that, you know, the United States should abolish the Electoral College. And the novice mistake that I saw was they just listed all the bad things about the Electoral College, but they don't explain what the alternative is. They don't explain the good parts about, you know, what are you doing now? Are you going to just do straight up popular vote? That's the most likely alternative. And so if
Yeah.
I'm on the neg, I'm going to be saying, it's like, okay, listen, I think that people should be explaining what the alternative is and why it is good. Because if you don't, then these vague, like there's the vaguenesses that come with that mean that it could go any different direction, and it's like an incomplete argument.
They could have an even more vague plan or something like that.
And then you say, all right. And secondly, if they're going to go in the next speech, if they're going to say, all right, we're going to go with the popular vote, here's my responses to why the popular vote is not better than the electoral college. So you kind of anticipate that they're going to try to like do it. And then, and the third thing you say, if they clarify this later in the debate, is like, I think that you should disregard it in the rebuttals. I think that is like in a court of law, you're supposed to lay out your case, right? You don't bring up new evidence in your closing arguments, right? That ain't cool. Like there's a reason why you do those things, is so we can actually interrogate these arguments and reasons and things like that. And it's just fair, you know what I mean? For you to bring out your arguments so I can address them. Otherwise, if you're backloading them in your rebuttals, it's like that's a poor way to argue.
Yeah. Anytime someone brings up a new argument in a member speech or a secondary speech from their first constructive, is called a moving target. Right. I don't know if you've said it yet today, but that's the response you would say. You know, the tagline of the argument is moving target. You know, originally they said we're defending building a freeway to Reno, and then they changed that, and now they're trying to build a freeway to Las Vegas or something like that. I mean, they've changed to the moon. They're, you've just taken all your ground away from all your arguments you've made regards to Reno. I guess if it's about freeways in general, then maybe you're still good, but I don't know.
Yeah, but you can set it up. You say like, it sets up potential abuse, right? Whereas like if I try to infer what you meant and then respond to that inference, and then you come back and it's like, oh, that's not what I meant. I meant something else. And now you have to come up with brand new arguments in your rebuttals. Like, no.
Yeah, infinite shift.
And when they do that, just because you're on a good point, Jared, like if someone does bring up a bunch of new stuff, the rules of debate technically say you're not supposed to bring up new arguments and rebuttals. But if they do that, you just say, I am going to discuss this for the first time in my rebuttal because they just brought it up and it needs to be responded to. That's literally articulated as your response to a novice mistake, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. I think probably the most, sorry if you had another point on that.
No, I'm good.
I think probably the most common novice mistake that I see is just disorganization. Because debate's difficult. Like it's complicated. There's a lot of arguments that are made in 15 minutes between the two, constructive speeches or the two, leader speeches. Like that's a lot of arguments that are made, a lot of words are said, and it can be difficult to organize, especially when you're new, even when you're, experienced, but especially when you're new, to keep all of that straight and then to know the right order to go through responding and getting through that. Like that just takes a lot of practice, honestly. Yeah. And I think the common stumbling block that creates when responding to disorganization is you're like, well, where do I go? My opponent made so many different arguments all out there, and it seems like it becomes this kind of quicksand that the responding team can similarly just slip right into the same disorganization, because they've got to go by their own metric. But God, is that so difficult as a judge when you've now got two teams that are completely, missing each other's arguments and going in their own directions, and like you've got to interpret where to put things. I think that's probably the most frequently like cut and paste ballot message that I've got for novice ballots is like, remember to state your opponent's argument. It's called signposting. Like reference the argument that you're arguing against so that we know where to put it on the flow. Otherwise, I have to choose where to put that. So that's a tricky one.
Yeah. So on the neg, answering that, you're coming up. What I would recommend is, again, start with your prep. All right. You're like, listen, I'm gonna lay out two disadvantages, or I'm gonna lay out two arguments, and then I'm going to do my best to respond to my opponent. All right, but it's kind of hard to follow what they're saying.
Send subtle jabs to insult their intelligence throughout the debate.
Right, and I think the judge will kind of go, I understand where you're coming from. All right, and then you get through, you're like, hey, and you're numbering it out. You're like, link, brink, impact. Here you go, second one, and now I'm done. All right, let me try my best. All right, the first thing I got was this. The second thing I got was this. It kind of sounds like inherency, and I'm going to treat it like that. Okay, and so here's my inherency responses to that. And so when you're doing that, here's another strategy that I always like is actually give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. It makes you look like you're really gracious. It makes you look like you have all the bases covered. You are prepared for everything. It's like, I think that this sounds kind of like a solvency argument. So let's get into that. You know what I mean? I think, in the best case scenario, this is solvency.
I was thinking, on that note, you're kind of saying the same thing I was kind of trying to say. You want to kind of do the organizing for them.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I was talking about earlier. Like, you can kind of front load. Well, they could have made this argument. Well, it's not quite the same. You're saying, I think what they meant is problem or harm, stuff like that, and just pigeonhole the arguments that you saw. Another thing I'd say, we normally hear it from judges after the round, but you tell the judge. Especially in a round where you basically have someone just spitting out facts in a non-linear fashion, and technically, if you put them in the right order, it makes a perfectly logical argument. But it may have sounded very much not like that. You say don't connect the dots for them. That's not what you're supposed to do. Now that being said, I'm going to superimpose some organization to what I understood them to mean, but. Don't think that because I'm doing this work or that you're doing that work, Judge, that they should deserve the credit. They just shotgunned out a bunch of stuff and it made us, in order to have a coherent round, forced us to do this. And so, because otherwise, like I think both of you were saying, you don't want to end up in the two ships in the night scenario where there's like no interaction. You gotta. If they don't give you a lot to interact with, you got to set it up to where you can interact with their arguments, because no one just wants to hear some disorganized speech and then you come up and give a great speech but have absolutely no, tie back. The part of the art of this is to acknowledge the other side directly, point by point.
Yeah. I think probably the most important thing, or what I wanted to talk about the most on this subject, is kind of the middle ground between those two things. So exactly, if you're coming up against disorganization, it's your job to impose that structure, like create structure for the round, because, in a wonderful case scenario, the other side picks it back up. And like now the debate is better because you helped them along. And like, man, does that look good in speaker points and just round, like a judge will love you for it. But there's a really important distinction between being like, critical of, hey, you've got, I think it was this, or I didn't really catch this, but we're going to call it this. Being tactful, like, do be tactful. Do not be a dick about it. I think that is the most common mistake against novices, is someone that just comes down, like brings the hammer down on like the other side was completely nonsensical, and they just start tearing up the other team. And you come off as such a bully. Like that is the worst way to respond to a new team. The absolute
like
worst.
when somebody doesn't have a plan text, right? And like the Electoral College, and you're like, well, they didn't say a plan text, so I'm going to assume that their alternative to Electoral College is forcing everyone to vote by gunpoint. Like.
I like it.
I see that a lot. It's like, well, they didn't have this required part of the debate, so I'm going to assume that they had the most stupid argument that could possibly have been made, and now they're stuck with it because they didn't clarify, so now I get to impose it upon them. They do that with topicality all the time. It's like, well, they didn't define it this way, so I'm going to say that they're defining it in the worst way possible. No. Like be rational. The more rational you are, the more likely you are to get picked up.
So often, in my feeling of the matter, like people often make mistakes, okay? And it's really, a moment where you can capitalize on someone's mistake. What we're talking about, in essence, when someone I think what we're originally saying is if someone gives a very disorganized speech, and then you get up there, technically you have, I guess, the right to say, that was the dumbest thing I ever heard. Nothing I said made any sense at all, and anything you're doing is dots you're connecting, and don't give them credit for anything. So I should win. I should just sit down now. But what you've just done, when you say that, you have just also made a mistake. So now, in my mind, and what's the mistake? You're being a jerk, like Tim said. I mean, you're just hurting someone's feelings in open forum.
Because they don't know the lingo.
Thinking that the judge is like on your side. And it's kind of
right,
like,
we're going to bully this new kid because they're new here.
And what's funny is when you were up there for 2 seconds before you said anything, they were on your side. They were on your side. They're like, you don't have to do much to separate yourself from that person. But now you said that, and even if you give like the greatest speech ever, like you're working uphill. Like the judge is like,
looking for chances to drop you because you're mean. No one wants to vote for a mean debater.
You know what's funny? We got to be careful because there's some mean judges, and I'm sure that it can pan out that way. And I guess know your judge. If you know that you have some cynical judge who's kind of mean-spirited, I guess tee off. But I would imagine.
Really?
Good advice.
You catch more flies with sugar or honey than vinegar, right? Like you should stay courteous, keep the moral high ground, and eloquently, subtly articulate they messed up. But
All right. Another very common mistake that I see is asserting facts without citing sources. Saying this is true, so why do I have to cite it? Why do I have to tell you where I got my information? I know it's right. How do you deal with it? It's like, I think the novice response to that's also a mistake is like, well, they didn't cite their sources, so they lose. You know what I mean? It's like, not necessarily. It's kind of like, listen,
what form of debate are we talking about?
Debate. Yeah, I'd love to get in this debate. I'd want to know where they're getting their information from because I have some contrary information, and the only way that we can break this tie is to see where the information came from, who is saying this, and that might tell us. We might be able to see like a bias or a discrepancy in how they collected the data might be poor, or any number of reasons that you can get information through that source citation that helps kind of like break the tie when you have loggerheads on contrary data. And so, but it's so hard. It's like, well, I know that, how many electoral votes California has. Why do I have to say where I got that information? Well, maybe not. That might not be the best example, but, it's like there's...
you make a good point, though. So what's the difference? And we've talked about it on the show before, but the difference between...
Common knowledge,
right?
Yeah.
And a specific stat. Like, when should you cite sources?
Yeah.
If you're doing any form of debate that is not limited prep, you better have a bunch of sources. And even in limited prep, like you have no excuse, basically. They give you 20 minutes. Like you're only supposed to go look for that information. You're supposed to know how to do everything else. So, I mean, I don't know. You said a lot right there, Jared. Like, what do you do when someone doesn't cite a source? What do you do when someone cites a source that says, biasnews.com or whatever? I mean, it's like, okay, well, we can have a whole argument over the source you're using. Tim, you can go ahead. I mean, where do you want to start with this?
I think it frustrates me a lot when debaters, I think it's a very common novice answer, will use their flex time to ask like, so you said this, do you have a source for that? Like, yes, I get the other side should have cited a source, but that feels, especially when that's the opening question, like you didn't have a question. And so this is your weak sauce way of figuring out a question. Yeah. Especially when it just becomes a battle of those, of like one side just continues to ask, well, they didn't have a source for this, didn't have a source for this. Like, yes, the other side should have a source for this. That doesn't mean that you don't engage, though. I think that it is short-sighted to say, if the other side doesn't cite a source, immediately discredit it or like don't allow them to talk about it. I saw the most just cutthroat middle school round where that like went down, that someone had trained their student that if the other side doesn't have sources for things, don't let them talk. No joke. And so like they like asked like the other side, like they called to these sources. The other side's like, I'm not sure, like I have my research elsewhere. They're like 12 years old. And it's elsewhere, like I don't have a source for that. And like, okay, so what you're saying is it's a complete lie. Like, no, it came from a source. I just don't have it right now. Like, but you don't have it with you, so it's a lie. And then wouldn't let them bring up that point anytime they tried to later. Like, no, we already confirmed that that's not true. Like, whoa, kid. I sort of appreciate the gusto, but like, dial it back a lot.
Perfect. That's perfect. I mean, there are some types of debate that have it in the rules that you have to have complete source citations.
Sure.
Like NFALD is a great example of this. It's in the rules. You have to have like certain information that you cite in your, opening arguments. And I've even seen people have, blocks where it's like they didn't cite their sources or properly. It's like they cited it, but it was incomplete. They lose. I'm kind of like, oh man, you know what I mean? Like, I think I don't know about that, man. It looks like I'm turning against you now. I'm turning against you.
Yeah.
I can collectively say it is obnoxious as a judge to see that kind of argument, right? Like it is not persuasive to me when it's just like they didn't cite something right.
Yeah.
There are lots of arguments that you can make. That is probably not the most persuasive one that you can go for.
Right.
Like,
right.
Sure, if you want to bring it up, but
the whole point is to get the judge on your side.
The Nazis had rules.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a
great point on the subject of arguments that you can make and should make. Exactly.
There's my response.
Yeah. Oh man. What are some other things? So we talked about like not using enough time, not hitting all the stock issues, being just generally disorganized.
Also, I think being courteous on both sides, like being courteous if you are the more senior one in the round and you are imposing structure, to also be extra polite. Like you will win way more points that way. If like you can be good and also make the other side enjoy the debate. Like that's.
I got a good one. There's one mistake that I see all too often is that it's not even novice. It's even it's like proto novice, right? It's people get a topic.
Fetal.
They just give you background information about the issue. You know what I mean? Like, and so like if we're going back to like, I don't know, let's talk about voter ID or something like that. Their entire speech
in 1774.
Yeah. Just give
the first instance of voting.
Of it, and they tell you how many states have voter ID and how many don't have voter ID and which identification is required in which states. And thank you very much. That's the end of my speech. I'm like, what the hell? What do you do? Like,
this is sick info.
Yeah. And so it's like they didn't make any arguments. They're stupid. They're losers. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, but they don't have a plan text or anything like that. Like you can get up there. It's kind of like on the neg. You're like, I think I've learned something today about voter ID. That's great. That's awesome. But I've also learned that we should not have it. All right. So and now you have to return it back to. It's like, remember, we're supposed to be taking sides on this one. Not just, this isn't the Discovery Channel here, people. It's like we are clashing, all right? We have
to create that clash.
Two quick ones that just popped into my head. One of them is kind of proto-novice world or novice world. Sometimes people just repeat a word over and over. It's like, the economy is going to be bad. The economy is going to be bad. It's like, that is not enough. Like, you need to say how something happens. So how do you respond to that? Articulate how like just because someone screams something 30 times in a round doesn't make it true. So you shouldn't vote for that without even with the citation. The New York Times says the economy is going to be bad. Okay, that's not what it said, right?
So how do you respond to it? You got to say is like, listen, like my opponent said several times this one argument. I'm going to address it once.
Yeah.
All right. And so here I go.
Yeah. And it wasn't substantive in any way and didn't have any linkage story to how it actually works. And just screaming repeated words over and over is never and should not win debates. My second thing I wanted to say is this goes more for everyone, I think. Not necessarily novices. Showing your cards. We talk about that a lot. Like when someone says something that's pretty, let's say you underestimate a team. You think they're a novice and they say something really good. Don't make this face.
Oh yeah, the nonverbals.
Like don't respond or even looking menacingly and angry like you're about to go kill him or something. Like you want to be very like neutral and don't let them
Professional.
know how it feels, even if you're cooking one way or the other inside.
Well,
yeah, the nonverbal is definitely key.
Yeah. I guess the last thing is like if somebody is screwing up on the other side, one of the best things that you could do is invite them into the debate more. And what I mean by that is kind of like they feel like they're losing. All of their nonverbals are expressing that they're losing.
Yes.
There's really no chance that they're picking up this round.
Yes.
I've even had people when I had like my one policy debate tournament that I went to, they like walked over and they're kind of like, "Hey, do you need any help or anything like that?" You know what I mean? It's like, and that's great. You know, that's a really nice thing to do. And I think that's you kind of go. I'd recommend. You know, you can like what we were talking about before. It's kind of like I think this is a solvency argument. I think this is an inherency argument. I think this is a pretty good argument, in fact. But I have responses to it, and here we go. And so. Like pumping up your opponent to
puts you on top.
Yeah,
in a courteous way. It's like, look, there's like one person who knows what's going on in this round, and I'm trying to help. You know, it puts the judge in your corner much more than the putting people down and negativity.
For sure.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Hey, that's our time. I hope this was helpful. I know, like novices, it's not just like what do I say, but what do I say when I know they're screwing up really bad? Like I don't know how to respond to it. You know what I mean? And take advantage of that. And so I kind of like this topic. Hey, that's us. We're DebateSensei. We got Matt Shapiro. He was able to make it back. And then we got Tim Seavey from San Diego State University. I'm Jared Kabika Miller coming at you from Bryan Head, Utah. We will see you next week, everybody. All right.